Dead Mail is a 2025 movie about a mysterious piece of mail that arrives in a post office and kicks off an investigation about a kidnapped keyboard technician. That is at least what the movie presents itself about. But this really isn't an investigation, it's more of just kind of explaining what happened. The movie centers on a mysterious letter that shows up in a small post office. Now, this letter was put in a mailbox by a man who was temporarily able to escape a captive situation and put it in before he could be stopped. The letter simply says he's been held captive in a White House on Route 119. Now, when the post office gets these types of strange letters, or there's no address or it's hard to read, it gets considered dead mail, and they have a department for that. In this case, it's a person named Jasper that will try and investigate it and figure out where it's supposed to go. Now, he does this by using clues from the mail itself, as well as maps, encyclopedias, and a Russian hacker that taps into the DMV databases. Now, this bloody letter comes across his desk, and he is compelled to figure out the origin of it. Now, why something like this isn't just immediately brought to the police is a valid question that's never really addressed in this movie, which I thought was an odd choice, but, whatever. Anyway, it's a great intro to a character and a great setup for a story. I mean, all we know as an audience member is someone is in trouble, but no more than what Jasper knows from what was written on the letter. We saw a man that was held against his will in a White House. Great. We are now along for the ride in this investigation to find out more info. Now, Jasper gets to work to try to get some clues. However, very early on in this investigation, the movie completely shifts to the person who's kidnapped, named Josh, and the man who kidnapped him, named Trent. Now, it's not unheard of in a story like this to routinely check in on the captive, but with this, it's in a flashback form, and it shows how this sort of happened. Now, what I thought was an odd choice was the next 40 minutes of the movie, the bulk of it, stays with this elongated flashback sequence where we learn exactly how this man got captured. We see the whole process of Trent meeting Josh and how he slowly gets to a point where he decides to kidnap him to perform this technical task for him. Now, I think the overall issue that I had with this approach is it wasn't quite as compelling as the solving of the mystery that the movie starts out with. And the entire time that we're in this flashback, the mystery of Josh being found is kind of put on hold. Now, I get the idea of showing character motivations of why a person did something in order to understand them better, but this goes so far beyond what is needed for the story. Now, the problem is, although we don't know the circumstances around why Josh was kidnapped, we do know that he was. And so the why is a nice detail to have, but it's not enough to hang 40 continuous minutes of your movie on. Now, when the movie opens, a story that is presented to the audience is a man is in trouble and someone has to find him. And the story begins to move forward as Jasper begins his investigation. But once we hit the flashback, the story stops. Yes, we learn how it happened, but the story itself cannot continue until the flashback is done. In other words, the story sits in place for the time that we're waiting. To me, it's always a bit of a gamble to have your audience ahead of the story, and that's what's happening here. The entire time that Trent is having his friendship with Josh, we know where the end is. So it's just waiting to get there. Now, I get that essentially every flashback in every movie kind of does that. But I think where the art of the flashback lies is in something quick, where the present situation and what the audience knows doesn't quite line up at all because they're missing crucial information. How and why he was kidnapped is not crucial information. So it just makes it feel like the main story is on pause for most of the movie while we watch this elongated explanation. Now, that's not to say that flashback is boring or not well done. That's the part that is the most unfortunate, is that it's all very well done. The flashback is interesting with some nice character choices and some compelling moments. However, it sort of lives in a bubble of being interestingly done, but overall not compelling enough to keep me interested because I'm just waiting to get back to the story from the beginning to someone figuring out this mystery. Now, one of the things that is always preached when writing scripts is that every scene should drive the story forward in some way. Now, that's an oversimplistic view of a scene sometimes, and the writer can play with rules at times to produce interesting results. However, the main idea of that statement is still mostly true. It's why generally when there is this style of movie where there is a captured and a detective, usually the movie will cut back and forth between the 2 points of view because the detective or the protagonist is the one mostly driving the story forward. Now, that's not to say that the captured can't also drive the story forward, but it's going to actually move forward, which in this case, it's a flashback. So we already know a specific point in the story, and we, as the audience, are behind that point for a while. I do wonder what would have happened if this movie was told more linearly, where the story opens with the meeting of the keyboard technician and the captor, Josh and Trent, and then goes forward from there, and halfway through the movie, he gets out and mails the letter, then shifting to the post office detective scene with Jasper. Now, I can't know for sure, but I do think it would have kept me more engaged because that would have been a progressing story throughout instead of starting forward and then going all the way back. And it's kind of a shame too because the craft here is really good. The movie is set in the early 80s and everything about the look and feel of this movie has an authentic vibe to it. A lot of times movies that are set in the 80s just use costumes and production design to give that world aesthetic, but otherwise it's shot in a very modern way. This movie actually is filmed in a way that emulates an indie movie that was shot in the 80s. It looks like it was shot on 16mm film with mostly 1 or 2 lenses used for everything, which will at times distort the image in certain places, giving it the feel of a small crew with a handheld film camera filming this movie. So it's almost a little meta in that it's not just the setting of the 80s, but it's the setting of a movie that was shot in the 80s. Now that's a level of detail that is really commendable. Anyway, I give points for the production design, cinematography, and the aesthetic on an overall small budget film. I mean, this really captured a very specific look that I applaud on the budget that they had. The performances are very well done, and I thought the pieces were in place for a compelling story, but I think the method in which they decide to tell it ended up shooting themselves in the foot and robbing it of any sense of urgency. I mean, just because you have a series of interesting things doesn't mean you have an interesting movie. I mean, that's the secret sauce that makes movie making so goddamn hard. Anyway, I'd give this a B-, but let me know what you think.